In the small, quiet town of Cedar Hills, Emma thought she had finally found her one true friend in Rachel. They met by chance at the grocery store. Rachel, with her bright smile and bubbly personality, was everything Emma wasn't, and that was the appeal. Emma, a quiet and somewhat anxious woman in her late 20s, had always been shy, and the idea of someone like Rachel wanting to be her friend felt like a breath of fresh air. Rachel came into Emma's life quickly. She was always texting, calling, and suggesting meetups. It was refreshing to have someone show that much interest in her. Soon enough, they were inseparable. Rachel brought out a side of Emma that she had long buried. They laughed together, went on road trips, shared secrets under the stars. Emma felt like she was living in a dream. But the dream started to crack. It was little things at first. Emma would often notice Rachel's gaze lingering on her for just a bit too long, her face unreadable. She sometimes caught Rachel repeating things Emma had told her in confidence to others, often adding strange embellishments. She shrugged it off, reminding herself that Rachel was her best friend and wouldn't do anything to hurt her intentionally. But as the months passed, Emma began to feel like she was being watched. She'd come home to find objects slightly out of place, doors she'd sworn were closed left ajar. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but the feeling nagged at her. One night, as they were out for drinks, Rachel brought up Emma's past in a way that left her feeling exposed. She laughed about Emma's fears, her secrets, and even some deeply personal things that Emma hadn't thought anyone would find funny. The words felt like barbs, and Emma forced a laugh, but her insides twisted. Rachel just watched her, smile never faltering. "Rachel, I think we need to slow things down a bit," Emma managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's smile faltered for the first time. "What do you mean?" "It's just, you're everywhere, you know? I feel like I don't have any space." Rachel stared at her, unblinking, before a strange smile broke across her face. "Emma, we're best friends. You know you'd be lost without me, right?" That night, Emma decided to put some distance between them, but it wasn't easy. Rachel kept texting, calling, even showing up at her door unannounced, claiming she was just checking in. Emma tried to push her away gently, but Rachel clung on, becoming more invasive with each rejection. She'd show up at Emma's workplace, sit outside her apartment, or bump into her at places Emma had never even mentioned. Emma became more and more unnerved. She started locking her windows and double-checking her locks every night, but the fear settled deep in her bones. She tried confronting Rachel one final time, and Rachel only laughed, saying, "Emma, no one knows you like I do. No one cares about you like I do." One evening, Emma came home from work to find her apartment door unlocked. Her heart raced as she cautiously stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" Her apartment was silent, but as she walked further in, she found something that stopped her in her tracks. A wall in her bedroom was plastered with photographs of herself, candid shots of her in her own apartment, at work, out with friends, photos she hadn't taken, photos that couldn't possibly exist. Among the photos was a single note, scrawled in red ink: "I'll always be watching." Terrified, Emma grabbed her phone and dialed the police. They found no one in the apartment and told her there wasn't much they could do without evidence of a break-in. But she knew it had to be Rachel. No one else could have been that close to her, that obsessive. Emma distanced herself from everyone, becoming a recluse in her own home. Every shadow made her jump. Every sound put her on edge. She deleted her social media, changed her phone number, and tried to start over, hoping Rachel would finally leave her alone. Months passed, and Emma started to feel a sense of normalcy. She almost began to believe that Rachel had finally given up on her. One night, however, as Emma was drifting to sleep, she felt her phone buzz. She had kept it by her bedside out of habit. Groggily, she picked it up, expecting it to be a spam call. Instead, there was a single text message: "I told you, no one knows you like I do." She stared at the screen, the words sending a chill down her spine. The text was from an unknown number. Her hands shook as she turned off her phone and lay in the darkness, her heart pounding. Then she heard it, a soft, unmistakable chuckle coming from the corner of her room. Frozen, she glanced toward the sound, and her heart dropped. In the dim light, she could make out a figure sitting on her chair, watching her with a twisted smile. Emma opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she heard was Rachel's voice whispering, I told you I'd always be watching. Sarah was a nurse, used to long, exhausting shifts at the city hospital. When she finally saved enough money to move into her own place, she felt a new sense of freedom. It was an old, charming apartment on the top floor of an aging building downtown. The walls were thin and the floors creaked, but she didn't mind. She liked the vintage vibe, the thick wooden doors, and the high ceilings that gave the place character. It was perfect. One night, after an especially late shift, Sarah collapsed into bed, barely bothering to take off her shoes. The second she closed her eyes, she was asleep. Around 3 a.m., she woke up to a strange noise, soft like the scraping of a chair across the floor, followed by faint footsteps. Groggy, she dismissed it, assuming it was her downstairs neighbor. But the noise persisted. She lay there, heart thumping, as the sound grew closer. It stopped just outside her bedroom door. Holding her breath, Sarah waited, listening. Nothing. Silence. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just the building settling, but she could have sworn she heard soft breathing on the other side of her door. She drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, Sarah asked her neighbors about the noises, but no one seemed to know anything. The tenant below her hadn't been home that night. She tried to shake it off, but she couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The following night, as she lay in bed, it started again. The same scraping sound, like someone dragging a chair across the floor, echoed through the quiet. Then came the footsteps, soft but unmistakable, heading toward her room. She held her breath as they stopped right outside her door, and this time, the handle rattled slightly. Terrified, Sarah scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone to call the police, but just as she unlocked her phone, the noises stopped. She waited, heart pounding, but there was nothing. The silence was so complete, it was like the entire building was holding its breath with her. When she called the building manager the next day, he laughed it off, saying it was probably the pipes or the old floors. But Sarah knew what she had heard. Determined to prove something was wrong, she bought a small camera and set it up outside her bedroom door, hoping to catch the source of the noise. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the camera's blinking light on her phone app, watching for any movement. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just when she started to doubt herself, there it was, the scraping, the slow, deliberate footsteps heading toward her door. Her heart raced as she watched the live feed. But what she saw on the screen was far worse than she had imagined. A man, gaunt and wild-eyed, was crawling on the floor, inching his way toward her room. He moved slowly, dragging himself forward with one hand, his eyes fixated on her door while his lips formed silent words. In his other hand, he held a long, gleaming knife. Sarah stifled a scream, watching in horror as he reached her door and began scratching at it, almost lovingly. The camera's night vision highlighted the cold gleam of his eyes, and she could make out his mouth moving, repeating the same chilling phrase, "I know you're in there. I know you're in there." Panicking, she dialed 911, whispering into the phone. She could barely hear herself over the sound of her heart pounding, but she managed to explain the situation. The operator told her to lock herself in the bathroom and wait. As she slipped out of bed and crept toward the bathroom, her eyes were glued to the screen. The man was still there, scratching, whispering, pressing his ear against the door as if he could hear her breathing. Then he froze. He turned his head, looking directly at the camera. Sarah's stomach dropped as he stared straight through the screen, his lips curling into a sick, twisted grin. He raised a finger to his lips, as if to say, "Shh." Before she could react, the screen went black. The police arrived within minutes, but they found no one in the apartment. The only sign he'd been there was a single scratch on her bedroom door and a knife, left in the middle of her floor. Shaken, Sarah moved out the next morning. She never went back. But sometimes she'd wake up in her new apartment to the soft, scraping sound of a chair being dragged across the floor, followed by faint, slow footsteps outside her door. David was never afraid of being alone. He actually preferred it, taking comfort in the solitude of his small cabin in the woods. He'd bought the place as a retreat from the noise of the city, a place where he could work on his art in peace, away from the distractions of modern life. The cabin was isolated, with no other houses for miles. That was exactly what he wanted, or so he thought. One evening, as he was putting the finishing touches on a painting, he noticed the power flicker. Just a quick blink, but enough to make him pause. When it happened again, he sighed, figuring it was the fault of the old generator he'd bought secondhand. With a flashlight in hand, he went outside to check it, feeling the chill of the night air on his skin. As he fiddled with the generator, he noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft earth, leading around the back of the cabin. They weren't his. He hadn't been outside all day. His pulse quickened as he shone the flashlight around, searching the shadows. But there was nothing out there except the trees, dark and silent. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself it was just an animal. Yet as he walked back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next night, David was working late again, but now he couldn't focus. He kept hearing sounds. Faint taps, like something lightly brushing against the windows, the crunch of leaves underfoot just outside. Every time he checked, he saw nothing. The empty forest stared back at him, but he could feel eyes on him, hidden somewhere beyond the tree line. That night, he barely slept, his dreams filled with shadowy figures lurking just outside his door. When morning came, he decided he was being paranoid. Still, to ease his mind, he set up an old motion sensor camera he'd found in the basement. If there was anything or anyone out there, he would know. He felt a little better with the camera watching the property. That night, he fell asleep quickly. But just after 3 a.m., a soft ding woke him up. His phone had received an alert from the camera. Bleary-eyed, he picked it up, squinting at the screen. A video had been captured. He tapped play. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to make out a figure, standing just outside the cabin's front door, staring directly at the camera. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, but something about his posture was unnatural, almost puppet-like. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stood there, watching the camera. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the man raised his hand and knocked on the door. 3 slow, solid knocks. The screen went black. David's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he dialed the police, explaining the situation as calmly as he could. They told him they'd send someone to check the area, but it would take at least an hour for anyone to reach his remote cabin. He thanked them, then armed himself with the nearest thing he could find, a fire poker, and waited, his heart pounding. 20 minutes later, his phone dinged again. Another alert. This time, his hands were shaking too much to open it right away. When he finally did, his breath caught in his throat. The man was back, standing in the exact same position, but this time he was much closer to the camera, his face barely visible beneath the hood. David stared, paralyzed, as the man's mouth began to move, forming soundless words. David strained to read his lips, catching only the last word, repeated over and over. "Let me in." Then the man looked directly into the camera, his expression blank, and slowly lifted his hand to the door, pointing inside. The video ended, but before David could even process what he'd just seen, another notification came through. Heart racing, he hit play on the latest clip. It was his own living room, filmed from a high angle. The shot showed David frozen with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen in terror. The man was inside the cabin, standing right behind him. David spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The last thing he remembered before the lights went out was the cold touch of a hand on his shoulder and a voice whispering in his ear, "I didn't need permission to come in after all."